So, today I'll be discussing problems faced by practitioners in the counseling psychology field, specifically the problematic differentiation between counseling psychologists and clinical, and how counseling psychology practitioners can enact strategies to systemic problems. So, counseling psychology in Australia stands at an important juncture. It was originally proposed in the 70s as a complementary counterpart to clinical psychology, grounded in humanistic, developmental, and relational traditions. It came to be understood that clinical psychologists treat complex disorders, whilst counseling psychologists address mental well-being challenges. Counseling psychology today now faces shrinking workforce, reduced training opportunities, and a diminished public profile. It's widely acknowledged that a major contributor of this is the inequities built into the Better Access Scheme introduced in 2006. I will argue that these inequities are not grounded in evidence, but rather in political decisions, semantic distinctions, and an entrenched bias that favors a clinical or medical model of care. So, despite formal definitions that position counseling and clinical psychology as distinct areas of practice, research consistently demonstrates substantial overlap in training, competencies, and outcomes. In fact, a study by both our colleagues concluded that the two fields are more similar than different. Additionally, there's evidence to suggest similar outcomes of clients with complex mental health disorders for both clinical and counseling psychologists. And no wonder when there's so much overlap in what both do. So, the Psychology Board of Australia and the Australian Psychology Accreditation Council recognize psychological therapy as a core competency for both clinical and counseling psychologists. However, Medicare's Better Access framework restricts counseling psychologists to focused psychological strategies, creating an impression of inferior skill. This artificial separation is sustained through subtle vocabulary choices, such as mental health disorders being the focus of clinical versus psychological problems for counseling. This doesn't reflect valid empirical truth, but an arbitrary differentiation. This at first got me asking how this came about and what behind the scenes decision making went into this process. So, Lynn Littlefield, the executive director of the Australian Psychology Society, claims that the rebate was based off of mental health advisors to the current government and went against the APS recommendations. Outside that, there's very little information on the decision making in the policy, so not very transparent or evidence based. What this means for applied psychology. So, clinical psychologists get a higher rebate. That means more money goes back to their clients, more accessible to the general public. A lower rebate for counseling psychologists means less accessible to the public, but also reinforcing a public misrepresentation that counseling psychologists are less qualified, as was found in a survey on the Victorian public. But there's also a loss for the field of psychology, as there's a loss in philosophical diversity, narrowing mental health care to a predominantly medical model. This arbitrary distinction may also contribute to the perception of psychology as being pseudoscientific. So the crux of this problem is where science interacts with public policy. And in deliberating over solutions, we should ask ourselves whether psychology practice be guided by evidence. So let's highlight some potential solutions and then get into specific strategies and barriers. The current framework frames counseling and clinical psychology as competing. But drawing from ecological systems theory, we can view the profession as an interconnected system where diverse approaches strengthen the whole. So, part one of our solution is advocating for eliminating the rebate disparity, which could foster collaboration rather than competition, integrating medical and humanistic models to meet varied client needs. So, replacing this two-tiered rebate with a unified structure based on competencies and evidence-based practice. Lambert found that therapists' experience and alignment was a significant predictor of client outcomes rather than professional endorsement. International comparisons make this vision tangible as well, as the US, Canada, and UK counseling and clinical psychologists receive equal insurance recognition. Part two of potential solutions is promoting professional identity. So, establishing a coordinated advocacy body for counseling psychologists to better promote public understanding, professional visibility, and the value of humanistic approaches in mental health care. These two actions align with the scientist practitioner model, ensuring funding models reflect empirical findings rather than historical politics. So, potential barriers to these solutions is the entrenched size and influence of clinical psychology training programs, Medicare's resistance to change, institutional inertia, and public misrepresentations. So, strategies to overcome these: a collaborative advocacy with other non-clinical psychology specializations, promoting a cross-specialization critique of models of mental health care. Targeted public education campaigns to highlight counseling psychology's equivalent qualifications, building a robust evidence base that communicates to policymakers the parity of client outcomes. And it's important to note that the advocacy efforts and promotion of identity will not resolve these entrenched systemic issues, but it's about coming closer to being part of the scientist practitioner model. So this is about counseling psychology reclaiming its distinct identity, not in opposition to clinical psychology, but as a complement. This quote is from the developer of Gestalt therapy, discussing how the whole person is not just greater, but altogether different from the sum of their parts. I believe psychology ought to do the same.